A Lockheed L-1011 on final approach into Dallas is in trouble. With rain battering the aircraft and engines roaring at full throttle, the pilots struggle to keep it in the air. The tri-jet touches down in a muddy field just to the north of the airport. How did this technologically advanced airplane simply fall out of the sky? And could an unknown weather phenomenon play a part? This is Delta Airlines 191. Delta Airlines Flight 191 was a regularly scheduled flight from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, to Los Angeles, California, with an intermittent stop in between in Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas. The flight this afternoon was operated by a Lockheed L-1011-385 TriStar with registration November 726 Delta Alpha. The flight was scheduled to make a routine arrival into both LAX and DFW, with the exception of a chance of scattered thunderstorms to develop upon arrival into Dallas. Other than that, the flight was as typical as any other the flight crew had operated. Speaking of the crew, let's learn a bit about them. The captain of today's flight was 57-year-old Edward Michael Connors, Jr. Ted, as he was known by his colleagues, had been an employee with Delta Airlines since 1954 and was a very seasoned captain with over 29,000 flight hours, including around 3,000 in the L-1011. The first officer of Flight 191 was 42-year-old Rudolph Price, Jr. Rudy had been working with Delta Airlines since 1970 and was said to be above average in his knowledge of the L-1011. And his time in the aircraft would explain why, at around 1,200 flight hours on the L-1011 and 6,500 in total. The flight engineer of today's flight was 43-year-old Nicholas Nasick. Nasick had been with the airline since 1976 and had logged a total of 6,500 flight hours, including 4,500 in the L-1011. As I'm sure you can see, this flight crew was not inexperienced at all and was a very competent crew who worked very well with each other. As far as the rest of the occupants on board goes, there were 8 flight attendants and 152 passengers, totaling out to 163 occupants on board. Just before pushback, all 3 pilots studied the weather reports from in and around DFW, and seeing that it wasn't all that bad, made the decision to begin the flight. Flight 191 pushes back from the gate just a few minutes past 2 o'clock, and just after 2:10 p.m., the 3 engines on the TriStar are put to take off power as the flight departs Fort Lauderdale. At around 5:40 p.m., and now flying over Texarkana, the crew of Flight 191 tuned their radios into ATIS at Dallas to get the latest reports for weather, and what they hear is not very promising. At this point, thunderstorms have surrounded the airport from all directions, except the north. Connors, not wanting to fly through the storms, convinces the controllers at DFW to guide him to the north, around the thunderstorms. The controllers agree and give him a new heading direct to the Blue Ridge VOR. From there, they would fly perpendicular to and then straight in to runway 17 left. The flight crew acknowledges this flight plan and receives clearance to descend to 9,000 feet. As far as the decision making in the cockpit goes, the pilots are doing their number one job perfectly, and that is to fly the airplane safely. Now, for those of you who may not know why pilots tend to avoid thunderstorms, you need to know a bit about them. A thunderstorm's main driving force is the rapidly rising and sinking columns of air in its center. These columns of air rise with warm, moist air until the water in the air cools and condenses. Once the water, and subsequently the air around it, cools, it sinks rapidly. This water falls as rain. Now, as a pilot, it's these columns of rapidly rising and sinking air that pose the biggest threat to the safety of the flight, as they can toss the plane around violently and cause major discomfort for the passengers, or even damage to the plane itself can occur. Now that you know a bit more about how storms work and the dangers they can pose to an airplane, I hope that the decisions made by the flight crew to avoid the storms have started to make a bit more sense. As the pilots descended further, they watched their weather radars carefully. At around 5:52, Fort Worth Center transferred the flight over to the DFW approach controller, and soon after, the flight was given further clearance to descend to 7,000 feet. In the next following couple of minutes, the flight is given a varying amount of instructions from air traffic control, as they are funneled in behind a bunch of other aircraft attempting to land. As Delta Airlines Flight 191 receives clearance to turn straight in for runway 17 left, air traffic control sends out a NOTAM to all aircraft on the approach radio. Attention all aircraft. A thunderstorm has been reported on the north side of the airfield. ILS approaches for runway 17 left and 17 right are now in use. With this, the flight crew tuned to the ILS for runway 17 left and began to fly towards the runway. At 6:03 p.m., Captain Connors radioed DFW Tower and announced that they were on final for runway 17 left. Tower Delta 191 Heavy out here in the rain. Feels good. Delta 191 Heavy, Regional Tower. 17 left clear to land. Wind 090 at 5, gusts to 15. Thank you, sir. With the landing clearance obtained, Delta 191 now began to fly into the thunderstorm just north of the airfield. The following recording you are about to listen to is from the CVR of Delta Airlines Flight 191.
What? Lightning coming out of that one.
As the plane neared the thunderstorm, First Officer Price pointed out that lightning was being produced in the storm just ahead of them. This was a sign that the storm in front of them was intensifying rapidly. What the pilots don't know is that the storm has started to produce a weather phenomenon not many meteorologists at the time knew about, much less pilots. This phenomenon is today referred as a downburst, or more commonly known as a microburst. Remember the columns of air I was talking about earlier? A microburst is simply a strong sinking column of air. This phenomenon, whilst it might look relatively harmless, is anything but. A microburst, as it reaches the ground, will begin to disperse in all directions. The resulting wind can reach speeds of up to 80 miles per hour, or more. Whilst this can be devastating on the ground, it's what happens when a plane flies through it that we're interested in. As a plane enters the microburst, it will experience a sudden headwind, increasing the airspeed. As it continues to the middle, the headwind will disappear entirely and will be replaced by a downdraft, forcing the plane into a descent. As it exits the downdraft, the plane will enter the most dangerous part, the tailwind. As the plane enters the tailwind, it will lose all of its airspeed, and if the pilots have not built up enough residual airspeed, the plane will most likely enter a stall, At these low altitudes, such as landing, the plane will most likely never recover and slam into the ground. With the explanation out of the way, I will let you listen to the rest of the CVR.
Good leg.
Delta 1061, across 17 right without delay, ground 0.65 empty cross. 17 right, Delta 1061. 351 across 17 right, ground 0.65 empty cross.
I know you haven't had it for the last 5
Delta 963 and American 619, cross 17 right, ground 0.65 empty cross. 351, you copy the cross? Yes, sir, we're on the way, man. 351. Thank you.
1,000 feet. And 762 at a barrel. I'll call them off for you. Alright.
North American 178, turn the corner. Yes, sir, everybody around the corner when you're number one. American 156, contact.
It's around this point that Captain Connors realizes what's happening. However, by the time he notices, the plane has already lost way too much speed.
I'm losing all of a sudden. There it is. Push it up. Push it way up. Way up. Way up. Way up. That's it.
Hang on, it's over there.
The pilots, now in the tailwind of the microburst, are desperately trying to pull their aircraft out of the stall they've found themselves under.
586 in the position of 17 right.
Pull up. Pull up. Pull up.
Push it way up. Pull up. Pull up. Right turn off traffic, some mile per hour.
Delta Airlines Flight 191 makes a hard landing in a field just under a mile north of runway 27 left. The L-1011 bounces off the ground and is airborne again for another few hundred feet before touching down just before Texas Highway 114. As the jet crossed Highway 114, its leftmost engine struck a car, shearing the engine off and steering the plane towards a set of water tanks. At just before 6:06 p.m., the left wing of Flight 191 would hit the tank farm and start a fire and subsequent explosion that would all but disintegrate the airplane. The only bit of the airplane that would survive the explosion is the tail section of the L-1011, including the last 5 rows of the passenger cabin. Out of the 163 on board, only 27 would survive. The National Transportation Safety Board would start an investigation into the accident and, after about a year, released their final report. The NTSB determined that the cause of the accident was the flight crew's decision to fly through the thunderstorm. Other factors include the sudden formation of the storm and subsequent microburst on the approach end of the runway, the low altitude and low airspeed due to both the landing and heavy traffic in the area, and lack of training in regards to how to handle wind shear conditions. After the investigation, NASA would conduct research into developing an onboard wind shear alert system that would soon be mandatory for all commercial aircraft. Lessons learned from Delta 191 helped ensure that pilots in the future would have adequate information and prevention systems in place to lessen the risk of being surprised by a sudden onset of wind shear. Delta 191 has been and will be remembered as the flight that helped develop wind shear protection systems, and the effects can still be seen and heard in flight decks all around the world.